The first snowfall came earlier than expected in 1876, catching Lillian Jenkins unprepared as she stared through the frosted window of her small homestead nestled at the edge of Beaver, Utah. The bitter wind howled through the cracks in the walls, reminding her that she was utterly alone, her pantry nearly empty, and the winter ahead promised to be merciless. Lillian pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, taking inventory of what little food remained. 3 potatoes, half a sack of flour with weevils starting to appear, and a jar of preserved peaches she'd been saving for a special occasion that never came. 6 months ago, her husband Thomas had ridden out to seek work in the silver mines, promising to return with enough money to see them through the winter. 2 months later, a fellow miner brought news of a cave-in. Thomas Jenkins would never come home again. At 25, Lillian was now a widow with nothing but a small homestead and mounting debts. The life she and Thomas had dreamed of building together in the West had crumbled like the mines that claimed him. Her neighbors had helped where they could after Thomas died, but most families in Beaver were struggling themselves. As winter approached, visits became less frequent. Everyone focused on their own survival. The snow piled higher against her door as the days passed. Lillian rationed what little food remained, eating just enough to quiet the constant gnawing in her stomach. She melted snow for water and burned what furniture she could spare to keep from freezing. By the second week of December, she was down to 1 meal every 2 days, and her hands shook constantly from hunger and cold. On a particularly brutal Wednesday morning, when the wind cut through the cabin like a knife and Lillian had resigned herself to the possibility that she might not survive until spring, she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves crunching through snow. Peering through the frost-covered window, she saw a tall figure on horseback approaching, leading a pack mule laden with supplies. The rider dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who spent most of his life in the saddle. He was broad-shouldered, his face partially obscured by a scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the snow. Without knocking, he began unloading packages from the mule and stacking them on her porch. Lillian opened the door, clutching her shawl against the blast of cold air. "Excuse me, sir. I think you have the wrong house." The man turned, and she caught a glimpse of intense blue eyes beneath the brim of his hat. He unwrapped the scarf, revealing a strong jawline darkened with several days' growth of beard. "Mrs. Jenkins." His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that marked him as not being from Utah territory. "Yes, that's me," she replied cautiously. "Name's August Thornton. I've brought some supplies." He continued unloading, seemingly untroubled by the cold or her confusion. "Mr. Thornton, I don't understand. I haven't ordered any supplies. I can't." She hesitated, pride making the words stick in her throat. "I can't pay for these." August paused, looking directly at her for the first time. "No payment needed, madam. Just doing what needs doing." Before she could protest further, he had finished unloading and was carrying the packages into her cabin. Lillian stepped aside, bewildered as he efficiently stacked flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, and even a small sack of hard candies on her table. He added firewood to her nearly empty wood box and placed a burlap sack of feed for her 2 remaining chickens by the door. "Mr. Thornton, I don't understand. Why are you doing this?" Lillian asked as he worked. "Heard about your situation in town. Winter's no time for a woman to be alone without provisions." His sentences were clipped, economical with words. "But who sent you? Who's paying for this?" "Nobody sent me, Mrs. Jenkins." He tipped his hat and headed for the door. "I'll be back next Wednesday with more. Before she could thank him or question him further, he was gone, mounting his horse and riding away into the swirling snow. Lillian stood in the doorway watching until he disappeared, then slowly closed the door and surveyed the bounty on her table. For the first time in weeks, she would go to bed with a full stomach. True to his word, August Thornton returned the following Wednesday with more supplies. This time Lillian was waiting, having baked bread from the flour he'd brought. It wasn't much of a thank you, but it was all she could offer. August accepted the bread with a nod, though he seemed uncomfortable with her gratitude. He was a man of few words, answering her questions with brief responses or not at all. He never removed his coat or stayed longer than necessary to deliver the supplies, despite her invitations to warm himself by her fire. Week after week through December and into January, August appeared every Wednesday without fail. The blizzards that isolated Beaver from the larger towns didn't deter him. Sometimes he arrived with snow crusting his eyebrows and beard, his horse struggling through drifts that came up to its chest, but he always came. Gradually, Lillian began to learn bits and pieces about her mysterious benefactor. He ran cattle on a small ranch 10 miles outside of town. He had no family, no wife or children. He'd fought for the Union in the war, though he spoke of it only once and briefly. Most importantly, he asked nothing of her, not her story, not her gratitude, and certainly not her body, which she had feared might be the true price of his generosity. By early February, Lillian had regained some of her strength. The constant hunger no longer plagued her, and with the firewood August brought, she could keep her small cabin tolerably warm. She began to look forward to Wednesdays, preparing for his visits by tidying her hair and putting on her best dress, despite knowing he barely looked at her. One Wednesday in mid-February, a blizzard raged with such ferocity that Lillian was certain August wouldn't come. The wind screamed around the corners of her cabin, and snow blew sideways past her windows. No one would risk traveling in such conditions. Yet just past noon, she heard the familiar sound of hooves, muffled by snow but unmistakable. She rushed to the door to find August almost unrecognizable, covered in snow and ice. His horse stood with head lowered against the storm, sides heaving from exertion. "Mr. Thornton, come in at once before you freeze to death." Lillian took his arm, shocked by how cold he felt even through his heavy coat. This time, he didn't refuse her invitation. Inside, he removed his hat and coat with stiff movements. His face was alarmingly pale except for patches of angry red where the wind had burned his skin. Lillian guided him to the chair nearest the fire, noticing how he limped slightly. "You're hurt," she said, kneeling to examine his boots. They were caked with ice, and when she helped remove them, she saw his right sock was stained with blood. "It's nothing," August insisted. Horse stumbled in a drift. Leg got caught in the stirrup. Ignoring his protests, Lillian filled a basin with warm water and carefully washed his injured foot. A deep gash ran across his ankle, already showing signs of infection. She cleaned it as best she could and applied some of the salve she'd made from pine resin. "You shouldn't have come today," she said softly, wrapping his ankle with strips of clean cloth. "Not in this storm." August's blue eyes met hers, the most direct look he'd ever given her. "Gave my word." The simple statement hung in the air between them. In a world where promises were broken as easily as they were made, this man had risked his life to keep his. "You need to rest," Lillian said firmly. "The storm's too bad for you to leave now anyway." For once, August didn't argue. The journey had clearly taken its toll. She heated soup made from the provisions he'd brought in previous weeks and watched as he ate, color slowly returning to his face. "How did you know?" she asked suddenly. August looked up from his bowl. "Know what? About me? About?" She gestured around the cabin. My situation. August was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. I was in town when news came about your husband, he finally said. Remembered seeing you once or twice before. Then in November, noticed you weren't coming to town anymore. He shrugged slightly, asked around. So you just decided to help a stranger. His gaze dropped back to his bowl. Lost my sister in '68. Hard winter in Colorado, no one to help her. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Shouldn't happen to anyone. The simple explanation pierced Lillian's heart. August wasn't just being kind, he was preventing a tragedy he'd experienced before. She wanted to reach out to touch his hand in comfort, but something about his rigid posture warned against it. I'm sorry about your sister, she said instead. August nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy without inviting more conversation on the subject. They finished the meal in silence, the howling wind the only sound. The blizzard showed no signs of abating as evening approached. Lillian made up a pallet near the fire for August, insisting he take her quilt while she used blankets. He protested but was clearly exhausted, his injured ankle swollen despite her care. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and snow piled higher against the walls of her cabin, Lillian lay awake listening to August's steady breathing. This quiet, solemn man had saved her life, week after week, asking nothing in return. For the first time since Thomas died, she felt something stir within her besides grief, a tenderness, fragile as a bird's wing, toward the sleeping cowboy. Morning brought no relief from the storm. August insisted on leaving despite Lillian's objections, but when he could barely stand on his injured ankle, he reluctantly agreed to wait another day. They spent the hours in quiet domesticity. Lillian mended August's torn shirt while he whittled by the fire, his large hands surprisingly deft as they transformed a piece of pine into the shape of a small bird. When finished, he placed it on the table without comment and began another. You're very skilled, Lillian said, examining the carving. It's beautiful, August shrugged, passes the time on long nights. Do you have many of those, long nights? The question seemed to surprise him. Most nights are long in winter. I meant alone, Lillian clarified softly. Do you spend them alone? August's hand stilled on the wood. Yes. As do I, she said, returning to her mending. The silence that followed was different from before, charged with something unspoken. When their eyes met briefly across the room, Lillian felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. By the third day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white drifts and crystal-clear skies. August's ankle was better, though he still favored it when walking. He prepared to leave after breakfast, checking his horse and loading the few supplies he'd managed to bring before the storm fully hit. Thank you, Lillian said as he mounted his horse. Not just for the supplies, but for... She hesitated, uncertain how to express what his company had meant to her after so many weeks of solitude. August nodded, understanding in his eyes. Wednesday, he said simply. I'll be waiting, she replied. As she watched him ride away, Lillian realized that, for the first time since Thomas died, she was looking forward to something. The realization both comforted and troubled her. Was it right to feel this way about another man so soon? Was she betraying Thomas's memory? But as she returned to her cabin, warmer and better stocked than it had been in months, she couldn't deny the lightness in her step. True to his pattern, August arrived the following Wednesday with more supplies. This time, however, something had changed. He accepted her invitation to stay for coffee without hesitation, and when she asked questions, he answered more fully than before. She learned he had come to Utah after the war, unable to return to his family's farm in Virginia, which had been destroyed in the fighting. He'd worked as a drover, a ranch hand, and briefly as a deputy before acquiring his small ranch outside Beaver. In turn, Lillian told him about her life before coming west growing up in Pennsylvania, meeting Thomas at a church social, their dreams of building a new life together where land was plentiful and opportunities endless. "You regret coming?" August asked, his eyes intent on her face. Lillian considered the question seriously. "No," she finally said. "Despite everything, no, Thomas and I had 2 good years here before." She swallowed hard. The West may be harsh, but it's honest in its harshness. It doesn't pretend to be something it's not. August nodded, understanding in his gaze. "That's why I stayed. Back east, people hide their teeth behind smiles. Out here, you know where you stand." "And where do I stand with you, Mr. Thornton?" The question slipped out before Lillian could stop it, surprising herself with her boldness. August's eyes widened slightly, then a small smile, the first she'd seen, tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I think Mr. Thornton can be August now, don't you?" It wasn't really an answer, but it was a beginning. As February gave way to March, the brutal cold began to ease its grip on Beaver. Snow still covered the ground, but the days grew longer, and occasionally the sun emerged strong enough to create small patches of mud where the drifts had melted. Lillian started planning her spring garden, August bringing seeds along with the weekly provisions. Their Wednesday ritual continued, but now August stayed longer each time. He began helping with small repairs around the cabin, fixing a leaky roof, reinforcing a loose shutter, rebuilding her chicken coop which had partially collapsed under the snow's weight. Lillian found herself watching him work, admiring the sure movements of his hands and the quiet competence with which he approached each task. One Wednesday in late March, August arrived with an unexpected addition to his usual supplies, a small burlap sack that moved and emitted tiny mewling sounds. "What's that?" Lillian asked as he handed it to her. "Found her half frozen by my barn," August explained as Lillian opened the sack to discover a small calico kitten, eyes barely open. "Thought you might want some company." "For the mice," he added, as if needing to justify the gift. Lillian cradled the kitten against her chest, feeling its tiny heart racing. "She's perfect," she whispered, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I'll call her Hope." August's expression softened as he watched Lillian with the kitten. "Seems fitting." That evening, as they shared a simple meal of rabbit stew and biscuits, Lillian noticed August watching her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. The kitten slept in a box near the fire, occasionally stretching and making small sounds in her sleep. "Spring's coming," August said abruptly. "Yes," Lillian agreed, unsure where he was leading. "You'll need help with planting, breaking the ground." "I was planning to hire someone from town when the time comes," she said. "I should have enough eggs to trade by then." August frowned slightly. "No need for that, I can help." "You've done so much already, August. I can't keep accepting your charity." "It's not charity," he said, an edge to his voice. "Never was." "Then what is it?" Lillian asked softly. "Why have you done all this for me?" August stood and walked to the window, staring out at the twilight settling over the snow-covered landscape. "First time I saw you," he said, his back to her, "was at the general store, summer before last. You were laughing at something your husband said." He paused. "Thought it was the prettiest sound I'd ever heard." Lillian's heart quickened. "August, let me finish," he said, still not looking at her. "Wasn't right to think that way about another man's wife. Kept my distance. Then heard about the mine." He turned to face her, his expression raw with emotion he'd kept hidden for months. "Couldn't stop thinking about you out here alone. Needed to make sure you were all right." "So it was pity," Lillian said, disappointment coloring her voice. "No." August crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her chair to look directly into her eyes. "Never pity. Admiration, maybe, concern, and something else I had no right to feel. Lillian's breath caught in her throat at his proximity. And now I'm not sure what's right anymore, he admitted. Only know I want to help you rebuild, whatever that means to you. The honesty of his words moved her deeply. This man, who had kept his feelings contained for so long, was finally laying them bare before her. She reached out tentatively and touched his face, her fingers trailing along his jawline. "Thomas is gone," she said quietly. "I loved him and I mourned him, but I'm still here, August, still living." August covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a gentle kiss against her palm. The gesture, so simple yet so intimate, sent a shiver through her. "I should go," he said, rising to his feet. Lillian stood as well, suddenly afraid that if he left now, something precious would be lost. "It's getting dark," she said quickly. "The trails will be muddy from today's thaw." "Why not stay until morning?" August hesitated, conflict evident in his eyes. "Lillian, just to sleep," she clarified, her cheeks burning. "As you did during the blizzard." After a moment he nodded. "Until morning, then." That night, with August once again sleeping on a pallet by the fire, Lillian lay in her bed listening to the familiar sounds of her cabin, the settling of logs as they cooled, the soft breathing of the kitten, and now the deep, steady breaths of the man who had sustained her through the winter. She fell asleep with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in months. April arrived with warming temperatures, and the first green shoots pushing through the snow-covered ground. The weekly visits continued, but now August often came on Saturdays as well to help prepare the garden plot. They worked side by side, clearing rocks and turning the soil, planning what would go where. "Beans along this side," Lillian said, gesturing. "They'll get morning sun but be sheltered from the afternoon heat by the cabin. Corn over here," August added, marking out a section. "Then squash between. Indians plant them that way, corn, beans, and squash together, called the Three Sisters." "How do you know that?" Lillian asked, curious. "Spent some time with the Ute after the war, learned a few things about living off the land." As they worked, Lillian found herself increasingly aware of August as a man, the strength in his shoulders as he drove the shovel into the earth, the gentleness of his calloused hands when he helped her up after she knelt too long in the dirt. She caught him watching her too, his gaze quickly shifting away when she noticed. They danced around the growing attraction between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge it openly. April turned to May, and the garden was planted. The days grew warmer, and Lillian set aside her heavy winter clothes. She found herself putting extra care into her appearance on the days August came, pinching her cheeks for color and wearing her hair loose the way he once mentioned he liked. One Saturday in mid-May, August arrived with his wagon rather than on horseback. In the back was a young milk cow, contentedly chewing her cud. "What's this?" Lillian asked, stunned by the extravagant gift. A milk cow was beyond valuable. It meant fresh milk, cream, butter, and eventually calves that could be sold or raised for beef. "Name's Daisy," August said, helping the cow down from the wagon. "She's gentle, easy to milk, been producing about 3 gallons a day." "August, I can't accept this." "She must be worth. She's yours," he said firmly. "Had a good calving season, can spare her." Lillian stroked the cow's soft nose, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what else to say." "Say you'll come to town with me tomorrow," August replied, a touch of nervousness in his voice. "For the Sunday service." Lillian hesitated. She hadn't been to town since before Thomas died, hadn't faced the pitying stares and whispers she knew would greet the young widow. "I'm not sure I'm ready," she admitted. "You're stronger than you think, Lillian," August said gently. "And you won't be alone." The promise in those words decided her. "All right, I'll go." The next morning, Lillian dressed in her best dress, a blue calico that Thomas had always admired. She pinned her hair up, put on the small pearl earrings that had been her mother's, and waited nervously for August's wagon. He arrived precisely when he said he would, dressed in clothes she'd never seen: a clean white shirt, dark vest, and black trousers that looked newly pressed. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and when he helped her into the wagon, she caught the faint scent of bay rum. "You look beautiful," he said simply, his eyes conveying what his sparse words couldn't. The ride to town was both longer and shorter than Lillian remembered. As they approached Beaver's Main Street, her anxiety returned. "People will talk," she murmured. August covered her hand with his. "Let them." The service was both better and worse than Lillian had feared. There were indeed stares and whispers when she entered with August, but there were also genuine welcomes from those who had known her before. The sermon, fittingly, was about perseverance through hardship, and Lillian found herself drawing strength from the familiar rituals and hymns. Afterward, standing on the church steps in the May sunshine, several women approached to invite her to the Ladies' Aid Society meeting the following week. The general store owner's wife pressed a packet of tea into her hands. "A welcome-back gift," she said warmly. August stood slightly apart, giving her space for these reconnections, but Lillian was acutely aware of his presence. When a woman she barely knew made a pointed comment about moving on rather quickly, August was suddenly beside her, his hand at the small of her back. "Mrs. Jenkins has shown remarkable courage this winter," he said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Anyone who suggests otherwise isn't worth listening to." The woman flushed and moved away. Lillian leaned slightly against August's solid presence, grateful for his support. On the ride home, they stopped by a small stream where wildflowers bloomed in profusion along the banks. August spread a blanket in the shade of a cottonwood tree and produced a simple picnic lunch: bread, cheese, dried apples, and a small jar of honey. "I didn't know you were planning this," Lillian said, delighted by the surprise. "Thought you might need some peace after facing everyone," August replied, settling beside her on the blanket. They ate in comfortable silence, listening to the stream's gentle burble and the buzzing of bees among the flowers. When they finished, August stretched out on his back, hat over his face against the dappled sunlight coming through the leaves. Impulsively, Lillian plucked a few wildflowers and began weaving them together. August lifted his hat to watch her fingers work. "What are you making?" "A crown," she answered, finishing the circle and placing it on her head with a playful smile. "Every queen needs a crown." "And are you a queen, Lillian Jenkins?" His tone was light, but his eyes were serious. "Of my very small kingdom," she replied. "A cabin, a garden, a cow named Daisy, and a kitten called Hope." She paused, then added softly, "and a loyal subject who brings provisions every Wednesday." August sat up, reaching to gently adjust the flower crown on her head. "More than a subject, I hope." The air between them seemed to still. Lillian's heart pounded as August's hand lingered near her face, then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he traced the line of her jaw with his fingertips. "What am I to you, August?" she whispered. Instead of answering with words, he leaned forward and kissed her, so softly she might have imagined it if not for the warmth that spread through her entire body. When he started to pull back, uncertainty in his eyes, Lillian followed, pressing her lips to his more firmly. The kiss deepened, months of unspoken feelings pouring into it. August's arms encircled her, drawing her against his chest as if she were something infinitely precious. When they finally separated, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since March," he confessed. Lillian smiled, her fingers threading through his hair. Why did you wait so long? Needed to be sure you were ready, that it wasn't just gratitude or loneliness. And now, August drew back slightly to look into her eyes. Now I'm sure about how I feel. The question is, are you? Lillian considered his question seriously. What she felt for August was different from what she'd felt for Thomas, not stronger or weaker, simply different. Thomas had been her first love, youthful and optimistic. What she felt for August was tempered by loss and hardship, but perhaps stronger for it, like steel forged in fire. I'm sure, she said finally. I care for you, August, more than I thought possible when we first met. His smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and worry. He kissed her again, this time with more confidence, his hands spanning her waist. Lillian melted into him, allowing herself to fully embrace the feelings she'd been holding at bay. They spent the afternoon by the stream, talking more openly than ever before, sharing hopes and fears, exchanging soft kisses and tentative caresses. When the sun began to lower in the sky, August reluctantly suggested they return to the cabin. The ride home was different, something having fundamentally changed between them. August's arm stayed around her waist, and Lillian leaned against his shoulder, watching the landscape pass with new eyes. Everything seemed more vibrant somehow, more alive. At the cabin, August helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. I should go, he said, though he made no move to leave. You could stay, Lillian suggested quietly. For supper, at least. August searched her face. Only for supper. The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. Lillian took a deep breath. That would be your choice. He stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. I don't want to rush you, Lillian. We have time. She turned her face to kiss his palm. Winter taught me that time isn't always guaranteed, August. Sometimes you have to seize happiness when it's offered. In the end, August stayed for supper and left afterwards with a lingering kiss at her door, promising to return Wednesday as always. Lillian watched him ride away, touching her lips where she could still feel his kiss, and knew that something precious had begun. The weeks that followed were the happiest Lillian had known since coming west. August now came 3 or 4 times a week, often staying from morning until evening to help with the expanding garden, repair fences, or simply to spend time with her. They worked together during the day and talked long into the evening, getting to know each other more deeply with each conversation. Lillian learned about August's childhood in Virginia, the war that had taken his father and older brother, his wandering years afterwards seeking something he couldn't name. August learned about Lillian's dreams of having children someday, her love of music though she owned no instruments, her determination to make her small homestead prosper despite the challenges. In town, people had largely stopped whispering about them. Lillian had begun attending the Ladies' Aid meetings and found unexpected friendship among the women who had seemed so intimidating before. She brought eggs and butter from Daisy to trade at the general store, slowly rebuilding her independence. June arrived with its longer days and the garden flourishing under their combined care. The first vegetables were ready for harvest: tender lettuce, radishes, and early peas. Lillian preserved what they couldn't eat, preparing for the next winter which, though distant, was always on her mind. One evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, August took her hand. Been thinking, he said, his voice hesitant. A dangerous pastime, Lillian teased gently, squeezing his fingers. He smiled but continued seriously. My place is 10 miles out. Good land, but the cabin's rough. Built it myself, but it's just functional. 1 room like a bachelor would have. I'm sure it's perfectly fine, Lillian said, uncertain where he was heading. It's not fit for a woman, August stated flatly. But this place, He gestured to her cabin and the surrounding yard. "This is becoming something special. The garden, the new chicken coop, Daisy and her calf when it comes." "It's coming along," Lillian agreed, pride in her voice. "Though I couldn't have done half of it without you." August turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "What if we combined what we have? My cattle and your place. Build something together." Lillian's breath caught. "August, are you asking? I'm asking if you'd marry me, Lillian," he said, the words coming in a rush now. "I know it hasn't been that long since Thomas, and maybe you're not ready, but I love you. Have for longer than I should admit. Want to build a life with you if you'll have me." Tears filled Lillian's eyes, not of sorrow but of overwhelming joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, August." His face lit with happiness, and he pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a wooden ring, intricately carved with a pattern of leaves and flowers. "Made this," he said, suddenly shy. "It's just temporary, until I can get you a proper one in town, but I wanted you to have something." Lillian extended her left hand, watching as he slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "It's beautiful," she said truthfully. "I'll treasure it always, even when I have a gold one too." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Beaver. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, attended by the friends Lillian had made in town and a few of August's fellow ranchers. Lillian wore a new dress of pale blue cotton, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. August wore a new black suit that made him look taller and more handsome than ever. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, and August kissed her before all assembled, Lillian felt a circle completing from despair to hope, from isolation to connection, from mere survival to the promise of happiness. They held a small reception at the town hall, with food contributed by the Ladies' Aid Society and music provided by a fiddler and banjo player from a neighboring ranch. August surprised Lillian by leading her onto the floor for the first dance, moving with unexpected grace for a man who spent most of his life on horseback. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked as he guided her confidently through the steps. "My mother insisted all her sons learn," he replied with a smile. "Said no child of hers would embarrass a lady on a dance floor." As they swayed to the music, August leaned down to whisper in her ear, "You've made me the happiest man in Utah Territory today, Mrs. Thornton." The new name sent a thrill through her. Lillian Thornton. It sounded right somehow, a new identity to match her new beginning. They spent their wedding night in a small room above the general store that the owner had decorated with fresh flowers and clean linens as a wedding gift. August was tender and patient, his touch awakening feelings in Lillian that were both familiar and entirely new. In the quiet aftermath, lying in his arms with her head on his chest, Lillian felt a deep contentment settle over her. "What are you thinking about?" August asked, his fingers trailing lazily up and down her bare arm. "How strange life is," she replied honestly. "Last winter I thought I might die alone in that cabin. Now I'm here with you, starting a new life." August's arms tightened around her. "You'll never be alone again. I promise you that." The next morning, they returned to what was now their cabin. August had moved his cattle to pastures nearby and would eventually bring over the few possessions he cared about from his bachelor cabin. For now, though, they focused on settling into their new routine as husband and wife. The summer passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. They expanded the garden, built a proper barn for Daisy and the calf she delivered in July. A healthy bull calf that August predicted would fetch a good price when grown, and added a room onto the cabin. August taught Lillian about raising cattle, and she taught him her mother's recipes for preserving fruits and vegetables. In the evenings, They would sit on their porch watching the sunset, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. August continued his habit of whittling, creating small animals and birds that began to populate shelves in their cabin. Lillian took up quilting again, a skill she had learned from her mother but abandoned during her months of grief. One evening in late August, as they sat together on the porch swing August had built, Lillian placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, watching his face closely. August looked confused for a moment, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice hushed with wonder. Lillian nodded. "The baby should come in early spring. March, I think." August whooped with joy, lifting her from the swing and spinning her around until she laughingly begged him to stop. He set her down gently, then knelt before her, pressing his ear to her stomach as if he might hear the tiny life growing within. "Hello in there," he said softly. "This is your father speaking. Your mother and I are very excited to meet you." Tears of happiness filled Lillian's eyes as she ran her fingers through August's hair. This man, who had saved her life with his quiet generosity, was now giving her the greatest gift of all, a family. The autumn months brought the harvest and preparations for winter. This year, Lillian faced the coming cold without fear. Their root cellar was filled with preserved vegetables, their smokehouse contained enough meat to last until spring, and the hayloft in the new barn was stacked with feed for the animals. Most importantly, she would not face the winter alone. As her body changed with the growing child, August became even more protective and attentive. He insisted on doing the heavier chores, built a cradle from pine harvested from the hills behind their property, and rode to the nearest large town to purchase soft flannel for baby clothes. He returned not only with flannel, but with a rocking chair for Lillian, and a small wooden box filled with peppermint candies to help with the nausea that plagued her early mornings. The first snow fell in early November, earlier than the previous year, but less threatening now that they were well prepared. August and Lillian celebrated their first Thanksgiving together with a feast that, while simple by Eastern standards, represented abundance to them: roast chicken, potatoes from their garden, bread from their wheat, preserves from their fruit trees, and a pie made with dried apples. As they sat at their table, hands joined in prayer, Lillian felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, the words meant for both God and the man across from her. August squeezed her hand. "For what?" "For finding me last winter. For the food that kept me alive. For asking nothing in return." "I asked for nothing," August said quietly, "but I received everything." The winter months passed peacefully. The previous year's bitter cold and relentless storms did not repeat. Instead, the winter of 1877-1878 was relatively mild, with just enough snow to blanket the landscape in white, but not enough to isolate them from town. By February, Lillian was heavily pregnant, her movements slower but her spirits high. August had hired a young ranch hand named Peter to help with the cattle, allowing him to stay closer to home as Lillian's time approached. Together, they prepared for the baby's arrival, washing and folding the tiny clothes, arranging the cradle near their bed, discussing names. "If it's a boy," August said one evening as they sat by the fire, his hand resting on Lillian's rounded belly. "What about Thomas, after your first husband? He brought you west, made it possible for us to meet." Lillian was touched by the suggestion but shook her head. "Thomas has his place in my heart, but our child should have their own name, their own identity." She covered his hand with hers. "What about James, after your brother?" August's eyes filled with emotion. "I'd like that. And if it's a girl," Lillian continued, "perhaps Elizabeth, after your mother." Elizabeth, August repeated, testing the name. Little Elizabeth Thornton, it's perfect. The baby, however, had plans of its own. On a cold night in early March, Lillian woke to sharp pains and the realization that her time had come earlier than expected. August rode through the darkness to fetch the midwife from town, returning just as Lillian's labor intensified. Mrs. Hollister, the midwife, was a no-nonsense woman who had delivered most of the babies in Beaver County for the past 20 years. She quickly assessed the situation and shooed August from the room, despite his protests. "Men have no place in a birthing room," she declared firmly. "Go boil water and then wait outside. I'll call if we need you." The labor was long and difficult. Lillian, exhausted and in pain, drew strength from the thought of August pacing anxiously outside and the child that would soon be in her arms. Mrs. Hollister was competent and calming, her experienced hands guiding Lillian through each contraction. Finally, as dawn broke over the eastern hills, a new cry joined the awakening birds, the strong, indignant wail of a healthy baby entering the world. "A boy," Mrs. Hollister announced, placing the red-faced infant on Lillian's chest. "A fine, strong boy." Tears of joy streamed down Lillian's face as she cradled her son. "James," she whispered. "James August Thornton." When August was finally allowed in, his face showed evidence of a sleepless night. Stubble darkened his jaw, and his eyes were red-rimmed with worry. But when he saw Lillian holding their child, all tension left his body. He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid they might disappear if he moved too quickly. "We have a son," Lillian said, her voice tired but happy. "Come meet James." August sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's tiny hand. James reflexively grabbed his father's finger, holding on with surprising strength. "Hello, son," August said, voice thick with emotion. "Welcome to the world." Mrs. Hollister discreetly left the new family alone, promising to return that evening to check on mother and child. August stretched out on the bed beside Lillian, his arm around her shoulders, both of them gazing in wonder at the miracle they had created. "He has your chin," Lillian observed, tracing the small cleft in the baby's chin that matched his father's. "And your eyes," August replied, though the baby's eyes were still the indeterminate blue of all newborns. As James drifted off to sleep against his mother's breast, August kissed Lillian's forehead. "You are the bravest, strongest woman I've ever known," he said quietly. "Thank you for our son." "We made him together," Lillian reminded him with a smile. "Just as we'll raise him together," August promised. The years that followed were rich with the joys and challenges of family life. James grew from a colicky infant into a curious toddler who followed his father everywhere, then into a sturdy boy who helped with chores and begged for stories before bedtime. When James was 2, the Thorntons welcomed a daughter, Sarah Elizabeth, who had her mother's auburn hair and her father's serious expression. 2 years after Sarah came another son, William, whose arrival coincided with the expansion of their cattle operation into one of the most successful in the county. Their homestead grew along with their family. August added rooms to the cabin until it was a proper house with separate bedrooms for the children, a larger kitchen where Lillian could preserve the bounty from their now extensive garden, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides, offering views of both the sunrise and sunset. They had challenges too: a drought one summer that threatened the cattle, an epidemic of measles that swept through the town and left little Sarah weakened for months, a fire in the barn that August barely extinguished before it spread to the house. But they faced each challenge together, their partnership stronger for having been forged in the adversity of that first winter. On a warm evening in the summer of 1888, 10 years after they had married, Lillian and August sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. James, now 10, was teaching 7-year-old Sarah and 5-year-old William how to catch fireflies in jars. "Remember our first summer?" Lillian asked, her head resting on August's shoulder. "When the garden was just that small plot beside the cabin. And Daisy was our only cow," August added with a chuckle, looking out at the herd grazing in the distance. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked, gesturing to their expanded home, the flourishing farm, the children's laughter filling the evening air. August was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Not in my wildest dreams," he finally said. "After the war, I didn't think I'd ever have a family again, thought that part of life was closed to me. And yet here we are," Lillian said softly. "Here we are," August agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And it all started with a half-starved widow and a cowboy with too many supplies." Lillian smiled at the memory. "You never did tell me why you brought so much that first time. It was far more than one person needed for a week." August looked slightly embarrassed. "Wasn't sure what you'd like or what you needed, so I bought some of everything." The admission, so characteristic of his thoughtful nature, warmed Lillian's heart. "Well, it worked out rather well in the end, I'd say." "Better than well," August replied, watching as James caught a firefly and showed his siblings how to gently place it in a jar with holes punched in the lid. "It's been the best 10 years of my life." "Mine too," Lillian agreed, thinking of how far they had come from that desperate winter. "And we have many more ahead of us." As darkness fell fully, and the children reluctantly came in for bed, Lillian and August remained on the porch a bit longer, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Utah sky. The same stars had shone down on them a decade earlier, she in her isolated cabin facing starvation, he on his lonely ranch haunted by memories of those he couldn't save. Neither could have predicted how their lives would intertwine, how a simple act of kindness would blossom into love, family, and a legacy that would endure long after that difficult winter was just a distant memory. August took Lillian's hand, his thumb rubbing over the gold band that had replaced the wooden ring years ago, though she still kept the carved ring in a special box with her treasures. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked on their wedding night. Lillian smiled up at the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "I'm thinking about how sometimes the hardest winters bring the most beautiful springs." August nodded, understanding as he always did, "and how hunger can lead to the sweetest satisfaction." "Exactly," Lillian said, rising and pulling him to his feet. "Now come to bed, Mr. Thornton. Tomorrow is another day on this adventure we've created." Hand in hand, they walked into their home, closing the door on the quiet Utah night and opening it to the promise of another day together, a promise that had begun with a starving widow, a generous cowboy, and a love that asked for nothing but gave everything.